Hello, and welcome to The Beat, a news and talk program brought to you by the Center of Community Media at Worcester State University. I'm your host, Holly Van Wie, and today we will be interviewing Fran Manocchio, the Director of Student Accessibility Services here at Worcester State. Can you introduce yourself and tell us about your role as the Director of Student Accessibility Services?
Sure, I'd love to. So I've been at Worcester State, I'm in my 11th year, and my background has been in human services throughout my career. I'm 60-something years old, and I'm a first-gen college graduate. My mom was a high school dropout, and my dad had a few semesters of college on the GI Bill. I'm the oldest of four, and have always had a passion as far as helping other people. In my role as Director of Student Accessibility Services, I oversee our department, and I know we're going to get into the details of what we do. We have 3 additional professional staff and a host of student workers, graduate students, community support placement graduate assistants, and occasional interns. We're open 365 days a year. We're open all summer, all school year long, to meet the needs of students with disabilities.
That sounds great. I didn't know you guys were open all year round.
Yes.
That's awesome. So can you tell us a little bit about the Student Accessibility Services and the types of assistance you provide to students at Worcester State?
Sure. So every college and university in the United States has either a person or an office dedicated to meeting the needs of students with disabilities. It sometimes is called Disability Services Office. In our case, that was our name for many years, and then we changed the name to Student Accessibility Services, promoting a more positive identity a few years ago. And the types of services, the assistance that we provide is we're one-stop shopping for everything accommodations related. So for example, the most common accommodations students seek is academic accommodations, extra time for tests, reduced distraction testing location, lecture capture. Most of those students are students with learning disabilities who qualify for those kinds of accommodations, or it could be students with attention deficit disorder, or some kind of a disability where they may take medication that slows their cognition. We also address residential and dietary accommodations. So there's some students who live on campus who may have a physical disability and need to be in an accessible room. So we've had students who are wheelchair users, both power wheelchairs as well as hand-monitored, hand-regulated wheelchairs. We've had students who are blind or hearing impaired and require specific accommodations in their room. We have students who may have a medical diagnosis that impacts their meal plan. So we have students who may need a residential hall that has a kitchen so they can supplement their meal plan with food they prepare themselves. We also do classroom accommodations. So for example, we have students who are wheelchair users who can't be in a classroom that has those old-fashioned school tablet desks. Or they can't be in a classroom that's not physically accessible for a wheelchair. And then we have communication access accommodations, and that would be for students who are deaf or hard of hearing, or perhaps visually impaired. And they may need some specific communication strategies. It could be closed captioning for videos. It could be an American Sign Language interpreter in the classroom. So anything to do with breaking down barriers and making our programs, curriculum, events, and attitudes accessible to students who have challenges.
That's wonderful. And I'm also really glad that you've changed your name to Student Accessibility Services versus Student Disability Services, as it breaks stigma, changes identity.
Yes.
Very, very great. Thank you. What should What should incoming students do to prepare for when they want to register with student accessibility services?
Okay, so I'm going to combine a couple of our questions to answer this question.
Okay.
So there are some significant differences between high school accommodations and college. And that relates to the question that you just asked. So if you're a high school student and you've had an individualized education plan, also known as an IEP or a 504 plan, either of those most often include accommodations for a high school student. Those do not automatically transfer to college. And in high school, having an IEP or a 504 plan means a few things. One, that all your teachers know your diagnosis, so they know the nature of a student's disability. They also, all the teachers would know the students' accommodations and more of their story than they may want to have everybody know because it's included in the IEP documentation in particular. Third, at the high school level, there are other people who advocate for students. For example, a parent or guardian or a special ed coordinator or a special ed liaison at the school. So here's the differences with college. In college, our office is the only place that has the documentation that relates to the student's disability. We do not share that with faculty ever, except for a couple of circumstances which I'll explain. Students may come to college not having skills around self-advocating, but we work with them over time to develop those skills. And we need documentation in addition to an IEP or a 504 plan to support how the diagnosis affects a student in college. So those are some of the differences that lead to how does an incoming student prepare for when they want to register with student accessibility services. We have incoming first-year students orientation is coming up in June. And we share information with all incoming students through that process. We encourage incoming first-year students to connect with us if they want to explore the possibility of accommodations in college over the course of the spring or summer. Because we would like, if students are interested in accommodations, we'd like them to start the fall semester with those in place, not spend a period of weeks in September getting all that together. So it's something we encourage incoming students to do over the course of the summer. And they would need to contact our office either by phone or email or through our website or stop by if they're on campus. And we can include that contact information at the end of this video.
How do you promote student empowerment into student accessibility services? And can you tell us about WSU's chapter of Delta Alpha Pi's role in accomplishing this objective?
Sure. So student empowerment is something that we facilitate on a daily basis, starting with students learning about self-advocacy. So often with incoming first-year students, and sometimes with transfer students, a parent will call us or come into the office with their student. And we always will share information with parents and explain the registration process, but our primary focus is on the student. So we need to talk with the student. We ideally want to meet with them in person, and the parent or guardian could be part of that conversation to answer some of their questions, but the bulk of the interaction of the interactive intake meeting will be with the student. So that's one way of empowering students from the get-go. And then we continue to encourage empowerment by having students share their accommodation letter with their faculty. We strongly encourage students to have a one-on-one meeting with faculty, to connect with faculty, review what their accommodations are. And particularly for first-year students, it can break down some of that barrier about the faculty is the one that has the authority and power and privilege, and I'm the lowly student. And if a student steps forward and has a conversation with faculty, it can let the faculty member recognize that they're reaching out, they're being proactive, they're asking for help, and we want faculty to support that. And that if they have any questions or concerns, the student is more likely to approach a faculty member after they break the ice.
Got it, yeah.
Delta Alpha Pi is an international honor society for students with disabilities. And our chapter is in its 8th year, and we have members who are undergraduates as well as graduate students. And there's leadership role opportunities, as well as members can also participate in training to be mentors for incoming first-year students, because that transition from high school to college is filled with pitfalls, and high school seniors don't recognize how significant that transition is from high school to college. So members of Delta Alpha Pi are mentors, and they just do a fabulous job. They're also involved in planning some of the events we have on campus to raise awareness about disabilities. And one of those events is an annual panel discussion called In Our Shoes. And for the first time this year, it was all student run. Our staff assisted, but a student was the moderator, and the panelists were all students, and it was fabulous. So those are some other ways that they get involved.
That's great. All right, and what differs from the student accessibility services in college compared to the services students received in high school?
Sure. So from a legal obligations point of view, the federal laws are quite different. So there's one law called IDEA that applies to kindergarten through grade 12. And that law, boiling it down to the elevator speech, it's every individual has a right to an appropriate education in the United States. This all applies to the United States. And out of that law comes specific language about special education. So everyone has a right, K through 12. College is not a right. In the college setting, in general, there's an admissions process, and students have to meet the admissions criteria, and then they're accepted. Accommodations go through a process of students self-identifying, whereas K through 12, typically the school is providing evaluations and assessments, often at the request of a parent or guardian, and they're doing those assessments for free. In college, we need to have documentation. We don't provide the assessment process or the evaluations, and unfortunately, sometimes families have to pay for an evaluation. In high school, students are not necessarily encouraged to be engaged in self-advocacy, as I discussed a few minutes ago. In college, that's a necessity. In high school, curriculum may be modified to have a student who receives special education services have a lower workload or a less rigorous workload. That absolutely does not happen in college. As you know, being a college student, a professor shares a syllabus with the entire class. There's no ifs, ands, and buts. That syllabus applies to everybody, and you're graded accordingly. So if you had an accommodation in high school that for every paper 2 pages or longer, you could do 50% of that it ends at grade 12. We don't have those kind of modifications in college. So those are some of the key ones.
Well, thank you very much for clarifying.
Sure.
How does student accessibility services help students who would like to request accommodations for testing?
Sure. So of the academic accommodations, accommodations for testing are the most common. And that would be extra time for tests or a reduced distraction testing location. So to clarify for our audience, extra time for tests is not unlimited. So it's either time and a half. So if your class has an exam that's going to be 1 hour, you would get an hour and a half, or double time, and in that case it would be 2 hours. So it's very specific. If your professor is allowing everybody to have 24 hours to do the exam, which has happened more and more through the COVID pandemic, where faculty are giving longer lengths of time for take-home exams, then the extra time doesn't apply. If you're taking an online quiz every week, for example, some of the math classes or science classes get 15 minutes or 20 minutes for a quiz. The extra time typically applies for those situations. So that's all through the registration process, and we have through the intake interview, we review documentation, we talk with students about what they are requesting, and then determine if they're eligible for those accommodations. Because a student verbally requests extra time for tests doesn't mean we say, yes, we'll make that happen. There has to be, we call it connecting the dots. So the student requests an accommodation, we have to have written documentation that supports that. And then from our expertise, we agree or disagree.
Right, so it is a process.
It's definitely a process. It's an interactive process. The student's perspective is really key, and we take all of those pieces into account before we make a determination. It can be frustrating for students who don't have documentation, but know that they've got some challenges, so we do our best to refer those students to resources off campus that could be helpful.
Okay, well that's great. Thank you so much.
Sure.
If possible, can you share an example of how your office has helped a student find success during college?
How much more time do we have, Holly? Because I could regale you with a lot of stories. We have many success stories.
Okay.
So a couple of people come to mind. We had a student who was deaf. And she was non-traditional age and had 2 children at home, worked part-time and was a part-time student.
Wow.
She had sign language interpreters. American Sign Language was the way that she used to communicate. And if you're not familiar with American Sign Language, think about it as her first language was not English. It was sign language, which is really different than English. So many people who are deaf and use sign language have some written expression challenges because that's not written expression's not their first form of communication. She plugged away. She had some challenges with faculty. But overall, she did great. She was in our honor society. She was on the dean's list, and she's working at another university in disability services with deaf students. So she's one that comes to mind. Another student who comes to mind is a student who is currently a student here. She'll be a senior in the fall, and she happens to be a wheelchair user. And we've been able to deal with accessibility issues on the main campus that have broken down some barriers for her. And a few years ago, she wanted to take an art class at the Worcester Center for Crafts. So we did a field trip and we discovered some barriers. The student was so discouraged by what we discovered that she was ready to drop out of school. But I'm a dog on a bone for these students, so I was We didn't want that to happen. And it took some, part of my role is dealing with the accessibility issues and learning how to get the administration to say yes. So we worked with those barriers, and since then, since that semester, she's taken a few classes. And why I bring up that example is that not all students with disabilities register with disability services or accessibility services across the country. Mm-hmm. About 21% of students who attend college have some form of a disability or could benefit from accessibility services. Not all of those do, partially because of stigma, partially because of the self-identification, and partially that they don't know the services exist. So that example, both of those examples to me are important because of the persistence of the students and some of the barriers that we had to overcome. Those students had visible disabilities in terms of the deaf student using sign language, otherwise you would never know that she had a challenge, mm-hmm. and the wheelchair user. The vast majority of our students have invisible challenges, which means they interact around campus like you and I do, and no one knows that they have a challenge. It could be a chronic physical health condition. It could be increasingly mental health or emotional wellness challenges. Anxiety and depression are just skyrocketing over the past several years. It could be a learning disability, ADD, ADHD, or some other kind of challenge, traumatic brain injury, et cetera. Those students also can fall through the cracks because some of those students have had a lot of special ed services, and they come to college and they're a free agent. And they're like, I'm done with that part of my life, I'm moving on. And then they might find us if they're running into some troubles or crashing and burning. So I just like to remind our audience that we're here to serve everybody at any point, whether you're an incoming first year or your last semester senior, undergrad, graduate student, matriculated, non-matriculated. We're here for all those students.
Is there anything else you would like to share that we have not covered today about SAS?
Sure, thank you, Holly. The last point that I'd like to make is that increasingly in the world of student accessibility services, we're paying more and more attention to how does disability as an identity fit into the realm of diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI work as it's often called. Many of our students who are registered with us have multiple identities, and disability is just one of those identities. And so one of our overall goals of our department is to promote disability as an aspect of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because a sense of belongingness is really critical for our students, and that's part of the role that we play, and also to educate the campus community that disability is an important part of the conversation from a social justice point of view about diversity, equity, and inclusion here at Worcester State University.
Absolutely, Fran. Well, thank you so much for all of your insight today on student accessibility services and for keeping Worcester State in a good place.
Oh, my pleasure, Holly. Thank you.
Thank you for watching this segment of The Beat. Please remember to like us on Facebook and follow us on Twitter and Instagram. We'll see you next time.